Doomsday Clock on US national debt now at 10 seconds to midnight. With the 2024 general election now looming, the Doomsday Clock on the US national debt has now moved to 10 seconds to midnight. Whether it moves closer to or back from midnight will depend not only on who moves into the White House and occupies the Oval Office on January 20th, 2025, but on where the balance lies in both houses of Congress. If Donald Trump is back where he clearly doesn't belong on that date, the clock will move to 1 second to midnight. If Kamala Harris takes her place as the First Lady President, but her party lacks working majorities in both houses, the clock will move to 2 seconds to midnight. Only if Ms. Harris becomes President and the Democrats have control of Congress and can pass legislation to reverse the disastrous fiscal trajectory of the USA, which it has been on for most of the past 43 years, other than during 1993 to 2001, will the clock move back and move away from midnight. The USA has been on the path to self-destruction for most of the period from 1981 onwards, due to the steady decline in the real incomes of most people resulting from the growth of the national debt, which has been growing much faster than the economy, and the growth of the cost of servicing the debt, interest on US Treasury bonds growing much faster than taxation revenues. Interest is a growing proportion of each successive year's budget outlays, forcing ever greater stringency on all other funding commitments, consuming an ever-growing proportion of the wealth generated by the economy, leaving an ever-reducing proportion to serve as the national income. This is the principal reason for the steady decline in the living standards which has plagued most Americans during the last 43 years, other than during 1993 to 2001. It is important to note that there is no hand-in-hand, in lockstep relationship between the growth of the national debt and the growth of interest. Interest can grow at a much faster rate than the debt, especially when inflation is surging, because of the influence of inflation on interest rates. If Trump returns to the presidency on January 20th, 2025, everyone who supports or favours Trump should face reality about what will happen to his new presidency. It appears as if everyone has forgotten that in 2016, it was very clear the Republican Party did not want Trump as their candidate. This has remained unchanged. During 2024, the Republican Party has been feigning support for Trump with the intent to ride on his coattails to victory and regain the White House and the presidency. They would also be hoping that everyone who votes for Trump would vote Republican down the line, enabling them to win control of both houses of Congress. Once he is sworn in, if the Republicans have control of Congress, they will pass all of the legislation on their wish list and get him to sign it into law. They will implement Project 2025 to establish one-party rule by the Republican Party in perpetuity. Once this has been done, a deputation of Republican congressional leaders and leading officials in the party will meet with Trump in the Oval Office and tell him they want him to resign to enable J.D. Vance to succeed him as president. Naturally, he will refuse, and they will then explain to him the consequences of refusal. The fraud case against him will proceed. He will be convicted and sentenced to a long stretch in jail. But if he then agreed to go, he'll be fined heavily but not jailed. The Republican Party would get its way, one way or the other. An alternate course would be to act upon his well-documented crazy behaviour towards all of his staff by asserting that he fits the definition laid down in the 25th Amendment as unable to discharge the duties of the presidency. The Vice President, Vance, and all of the cabinet members would sign the necessary declaration and transmit it to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate, as required under Section 4, and Vance would become president. The congressional Republicans would then implement their version of budget repair, abolishing Medicare and Social Security and implementing further large tax cuts, overwhelmingly favouring the rich, and the consequence would be that the economy would hit a brick wall due to the collapse in demand resulting from the loss of so much government funding pouring into the economy in Medicare and Social Security payments. As the economy went into recession or depression, taxation revenues would collapse, guaranteeing the collapse would be total. Once the economy had totally collapsed, distribution of goods, most importantly foodstuffs of all kinds, around the country would grind to a halt, causing hunger and then starvation. Only those who had stocked up on foodstuffs in advance would fare okay initially, but they would be in grave danger from desperate people who were aware of their stockpiles, and the USA has 66 million gun owners. What follows involves quoting some copyright material and is presented here on the basis that it constitutes fair use as sanctioned by Section 107 of the US Copyright Act and similar provisions in the Copyright Acts of other countries. Certainly it is presented here in the spirit in which Bankruptcy 1995 was written, to warn the American people of the impending economic disaster which was guaranteed to happen unless the budget returned to a responsible and sustainable fiscal course. Bankruptcy 1995 by Harry E. Figge and Gerald Swanson, published by Little, Brown and Company in 1992, presented a truly frightening picture of what would happen as the US economy went into a total meltdown. Bankruptcy 1995 warns that packs of heavily armed, desperate men would roam the cities, suburbs and regional areas, taking whatever they need from anyone who possessed it at gunpoint. So what should all who support Donald Trump do? All of Trump's cult members, other supporters, Republicans and everyone else who intended to vote for him and who would have not already voted in early voting would be doing him a big favour by voting for Kamala Harris instead. Losing to Harris would be a much less humiliating outcome for him than being unceremoniously dumped from the presidency by the Republican Party. Trump supporters would therefore be able to hit back at the Republican Party to head off its plans from going ahead by voting for Harris instead. They would also be doing themselves a big favour if they also voted blue down the line, enabling the Democrats to implement budget repair, which would put the US budget back on a sustainable and responsible course, which would slow and then arrest the growth of the national debt and interest on it, thus averting the total collapse which would result from the USA continuing on its current disastrous fiscal course, along with the way generating rising demand which would quickly lead to a buoyant economy and then great prosperity, as was the case during Clinton's second term. The USA's path to self-destruction. The USA has been on the path to self-destruction during most of the past 43 years, thanks to the ghastly blunders Americans so frequently make at election time, spurning exceptionally well-qualified candidates like Al Gore and Hillary Clinton in favour of the most ill-qualified no-hopers and deadbeats imaginable. The 2024 election is almost certain to be the last chance ever for Americans to get it right, failing which democracy and representative government will end, to be replaced by tyranny, and responsible, accountable governmental administration will be set aside in favour of obedience and fealty by all officials and bureaucrats to a mentally ill, childish, sociopathic, narcissistic and misanthrope. The consequence of a new Trump administration will be that the USA's progress on the path to self-destruction will not just continue but accelerate, to result in fairly short order in the end of the American experiment, the complete unwinding of the American dream, not that that didn't stall and reverse course decades ago, the end of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, a term which would once have been applied exclusively to the USA, but must now more appropriately refer to China. But much more than that, the dystopian future which awaits the USA in the near term is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It is the total unravelling of the USA and its descent into anarchy, with its ceasing altogether to function as a viable nation state due to the total collapse of the economy, with the American people finding their once great nation has become a third world hellhole, a more terrible and dangerous place to be than any other on earth, due to the ticking time bomb of the growth of the national debt and the cost of servicing it, doing to the economy and by extension to the USA and the American people, what Little Boy did to Hiroshima. And perhaps that is a good analogy. The USA has its own Little Boy, who is now bringing this grim prospect of national suicide, in which 337 million Americans march in lockstep like lemmings over the cliff, thanks to his deluded followers, devotees and cult members serving as a base of support through which he may hustle his way back into office as US President. A childish, immature, petulant, mentally ill, narcissistic, entitled grifter, a 6-year-old in the body of a man, and an incredibly weak child man at that, masquerading as a strong man, leading a once great but now fading nation into the apocalypse of total economic collapse and social dysfunction. Donald Trump is a narcissist with an incredibly fragile self-image. He is not a strong man at all, as many millions seem to think. He is incredibly weak, the sort of individual real men strike matches off, as Vladimir Putin did in Helsinki. This is why he is so full of admiration for tyrants, dictators and strongmen. He would love to be like them, but knows he never could be. They, despite their despotism, are real men, and he is enthralled to them. Kamala Harris had it exactly right when she recently described Trump as unhinged. And once this total economic collapse does occur, at most within 2 years after the election, but possibly much sooner than that, the most destitute people in North Korea will know that whatever the hardships they face, there are people in the world who are much, much worse off than them, most Americans. And the USA would have become the most unlivable and dangerous hellhole on earth. Now, with the total collapse of the US economy almost imminent, for once the top 1%, ordinary people, and everyone else in between have interests in common. A total collapse would leave almost everyone, including the wealthy, destitute. If this total collapse can be averted, everyone benefits. The total collapse of the US economy, which will ensue after a Trump victory on November 5th, was predicted in 1992. Bankruptcy 1995 was written by Harry E. Figge and Gerald Swanson and published by Little, Brown and Company and distributed in a hurry during 1992 to warn American voters in the election of that year that this was their last chance to elect a president and a Congress that would take action to shift the federal budget to a sustainable fiscal trajectory so as to avert the looming disaster which in 1995 would result in the growth of the cost of interest on the national debt having become exponential, consuming all of the revenue raised in personal income taxes and company tax, leaving nothing to fund all other budget commitments. The total collapse predicted in this book did not occur because Bill Clinton came to office and promptly implemented his deficit reduction plan, which put the economy on a growth path and moved the budget towards balance and then into surplus. But the US budget is on track to bring about the total collapse of the US economy during the next presidential term because the growth of the cost of interest has now become exponential. Just 2 years ago, in October 2022, the cost of interest on an annualised basis was $422 billion and growing since then, inflation has led to higher interest rates and the growth of interest has surged and has become exponential. In October 2028, the projection of the growth of the annual cost of interest shows that it will be $4.2 trillion, exceeding by $600 billion the combined total of personal income tax and company tax revenue. Interest will be the largest budget item, just $600 billion short of the combined total of Medicare and Social Security expenditure. The scenario forecast in Bankruptcy 1995 is set to occur most likely no more than 2 years into the next presidential term, unless prompt action is taken after the new administration takes office to reverse the disastrous fiscal trajectory the USA has been on almost throughout this century, since 2001. The opening chapter of Bankruptcy 1995 presents an account of what would happen to a typical American family as the collapse gathered pace. It is truly frightening. Most people would lose their jobs and their savings, as most financial institutions failed. Credit cards would be cancelled, prices would go through the roof, store shelves would be empty. In chapters entitled Death by Panic and Death by Inflation, the book describes how the collapse would occur, most likely through some combination of both panic and inflation. This disaster must be averted.